Well, we do know what Tavistock did. We don't know that she as a writer did it. But we know that a lot of writers did it. Maybe that's the angle. A lot of writers of her ilk.
Well, let's just take a look at Tavistock. When we talk about Tavistock, we know that they studied the psyche and that it eventually turned into the Frankfurt School. And that what was that? That was psychoanalysis. That was Carl Jung. That was George Orwell.
Freud.
That was Aldous Huxley. That was Toynbee. That was every major writer that has created the Tavistock socialist agenda.
Let's add a few more. Arthur Conan Doyle.
Absolutely.
The famous detective Sherlock Holmes.
Showing that the British have superior intelligence. And that, the rest of us can't even understand
When you have
Sherlock.
a very talented writer who spends their time thinking about a scenario for a book that holds together, and the characters hold together, and there's logic in the way the characters are developed, those are very sophisticated ideas because they want the reader to believe the story. That's their job as a writer.
They studied this.
Exactly.
And remember, remember, I hate people telling me what to do. If you wish to remember, please remember that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote the first novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther. And what happened? I think on the day that it was printed and distributed, numerous people jumped out after they started reading it. They read it to the end and then committed suicide. So they found that the novel was one of the most powerful forms of affecting people's emotions in history.
Yeah, and it's real clear. The record is clear that in the beginning of World War I, the Wellington House, which was called the British War Propaganda Bureau, specifically hired dozens of the top British writers to write propaganda lies and push those out on the public. Now, initially, it was to push them out overseas, and then they eventually got permission to push those same stories out on the British public. And so here we've got the best writers, the respected writers of the age, all telling lies to their people.
And it used to be, before that, it was pamphleteers, like Thomas Paine. And before that, it was broadsides, like what happened with, say, the Boston Massacre, which really didn't happen the way it did. But because they had already, Paul Revere had hammered out the silver reverse imprint that he needed to print the broadside days ahead. It took days to make that. Why then was the broadside passed out at the end of that day? Propaganda. And so you can create a whole war from one broadside. It was one image of I believe it was Franklin. Was it Franklin? Believe it was Franklin who said join or die, and showed the 13 colonies as a snake cut into pieces. Either you join or you die. Well, they found out that not only high tech, wireless, magic, radio, television, but they found early on it was print. And so when they studied print, this is what they found out. And it's very easy. Didn't take much genius to figure this out. What's the most powerful book? What's the number one selling book in the world?
The Bible.
The number two selling book in America is the Boy Scout Handbook. The number three selling book for most of my life was the trilogy of J.R.R. Tolkien. J.R.K. Rowling's. We don't know that that's her name, but we do know that her story sounds completely fictitious. No one so far, even including Tolkien. Tolkien was probably the greatest literary figure of his time because he had mastered 11 languages. And with the trilogy of the Lord of the Rings, the languages of the elves and all the languages of the different species, those were real languages and can really be spoken. So it was a real world you could enter into. It was a virtual world through writing. Well, if we go back to the original way that happened, it's fascinating. I don't know if we'll go there in this conversation, but they found that these novels were powerful. So what was then the best avenue? If the number 3 selling book, and actually number 2 selling book in the world, was The Lord of the Rings, and more people read that than anything else, and when you talked with people about it, they were what? Obsessed. What did they keep doing? Reading it over and over again. I mean, it grabbed people. So they said, what is the number 1 then best form of propaganda that there is? A children's book that is a virtual world. Is that not what Harry Potter is? Harry Potter looks as if it is a Tavistock created social manipulation showing that black magic is the way for our children to go. Okay, just stop and just consider that for a second. Now the number 1 best-selling book in the world, Harry Potter. Oh, she just happens to crank out one brilliant book after the next. And by the way, I read these books, at least the first 3 or 4 of them. They're hysterical. They're master writing. I don't know who wrote these, but whoever wrote them, I might even be a collective. They're genius as propaganda. I mean, you take that. I could go into the way that the story was created and the whole thing. It's an archetypal. It's basically a meme. What is it? It's the defeated young boy who has no chance becoming the hero through black magic. Hello, is that what we really want to teach our children? That muggles. Anyone who doesn't know black magic is just, well, sorry, then you're just left out. What? And she didn't do her homework. The books are not well researched. They're very, very, very shallow. Well, hello. Same thing for Dan Brown. Same thing for the biggest selling books that we've ever heard of. Why is that? Because they are written as Tavistock propaganda for basically social chaos.
Wow.
Well, is that not what Hollywood is? And Hollywood prostitutes and creates horrible versions of everything. Whatever the deprecation of mankind is, oh, that's the next Hollywood movie. Whatever the next ego aberration is, oh, let's do a full-length movie on that, and then a series, and then a mini-series. Because why? We want to talk about aberrant behavior, that is the intent.
Well, the interesting thing is at the end of World War I, when they were dismantling the propaganda ministry, they specifically took, we have the records of this, they specifically took movie making that they did during the war, and they moved that operation to a private company in Spain. Now that's fascinating, because obviously they knew that it was effective, and they had been quite involved with movie making both in the UK and also in America. And so they privatized that part of it. And I'm wondering if you go back and you start looking at the origins of Hollywood, if we're going to see some connections there.
Did you see that the most recent Academy Awards gave the best documentary to a film that was real, that was made in either 38 or 39, I believe, in New York, where they had Nazis, swastika, Nazi symbols, and a Nazi ceremony, and everybody was basically being sold out through propaganda to go for the Nazis.
No, I didn't see that.
Oh, it's huge. It's all over the news. It's gigantic. I watched it. It gave me chills. It was the same thing as a Munich rally for National Socialism, and it was being sold here as propaganda. I think it was Lord Grey, or no, I forget his first name, but his name was Grey, and he came to America, and he was one of the ones propagandizing America. Mm-hmm. Where was his headquarters? Hollywood. Mm. Hollywood is nothing but a bunch of lying, cheating, con artists.
Yeah, there's another inventory. They actually created these quite detailed inventories of all of their propaganda activity in the U.S. And the first one, the report that I saw, was written by Charles Masterman, who was a relative of Cecil Rhodes, in 1914. And it goes into quite detail and names names of all of the American decision influencers that they were involved with in promoting the British propaganda for World War I. And many of those were in New York, in academia, in business, and in Hollywood. the early days of Hollywood. So it stands to reason that these guys knew what they were doing, have known all along the power of movie making to shape what they call make opinion, not shape opinion.
Gray worked with Colonel House, who told Woodrow Wilson what to do. Woodrow Wilson
which had been in the late right around the end of World War One.
Exactly, and he ran his second campaign on his promise to keep America out of the war and to keep isolationism going. One day after the election, through the power of Gray's propaganda directly from Wellington House, he was their agent, working through Colonel House, who was another British agent, told Wilson what to do and controlled the inquiry, the group that later became the Council on Foreign Relations. And basically, they turned around and in a matter of months propagandized America so effectively, because at that time there was only print and newspapers and people believed it, right? And the radio. They believed whatever they were told.
Right.
So they went from voting to not go to war in a few months because of the propaganda was so effective that Americans voted to go to war. And not only that, made everyone feel guilty that didn't buy U.S. savings bonds or send a child to war, or you're doing a war effort, or that you're giving up sugar on Tuesdays, or whatever. Every American was propagandized to believe in that war in a matter of months. Now we have social media. The Orange Revolution, the Maidan Revolution, all of the social revolutions, all were started with social media.
Mm-hmm.
And it's 10,000 times more powerful than it was when it was just print or wireless.
Well, they hired in the First World War and in the Second World War, they hired very talented artists who developed these posters. And usually it was a phrase. It was like an advertising phrase that they would put on there. One of the most effective was showing the Kaiser killing a child, or the Kaiser boiling a British soldier to make armaments and fertilizer. And we now know that those were all lies. But the power of one piece of art, and then they combined that with these newsreels that they created that people watched in the cinema, and that completely changed the British opinion about the Germans, who were their relatives. I mean, that's the crazy thing.
Their royalty directly comes from Germany.
Right.
And the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute that had developed a lot of this type of propaganda had to be outdone by the Brits and the War Propaganda Board. And then for World War II, Hitler used this and became so effective that then the Brits had to up that.
Can I interrupt you? It is well known now that the Wellington House, which became the Ministry of Information, used the Frankfurt School's handbook on how to write propaganda.
Absolutely. So then the British decided, they did an analysis. Cecil Rhodes and others did an analysis, and they said they couldn't take over the world, though at that point the sun did not set on the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth nations of Britain. But at that point they decided that they couldn't take over the world unless they had America.
Right.
And so they put so much effort into propagandizing us that whether we know it or not, we have become a Commonwealth nation of the United Kingdom, and we have demonstrated this.
They turned their banking power on America, on New York, and in fact, really, New York was already acquired by the Rothschilds in the Bank of England and the British banks by World War One. So we never had a chance in the beginnings of our propaganda, our movie and media world. We were controlled by those forces out of London from the beginning.
Oh yeah, and the minute they got a central bank going here, that was the end of us. They did, they had two previous ones, and then the Federal Reserve, and basically it's the same old German, Dutch, British bankers, and it's not an exaggeration. You said Rothschilds, so people go, "Oh, let's turn him off. He's a conspiracy theorist." No, Rothschild sent Morgan over who was a teller, but by the time he reached New York, he had millions of dollars to start his own bank. He did that with Warburg. Look at Kuhn, Loeb, Schiff, Schroeder. They're all the same, believe it or not. They're either Lombards or they're Venetian Jews or Italian Jews who changed their name, moved to Germany. They kept changing their name, and finally, even the Germans changed their name and became literally the Queen of England, who runs the Bank of England. The Bank of England basically is owned by the Queen of England.
So why did you make that comment about the Rothschilds and conspiracy theory?
Because it ain't a conspiracy.
It's not conspiracy.
It's not a conspiracy.
They're on the Privy Council right now.
Oh, you can't get a Rothschild deal, whether it be Genie
they
Oil.
They practically run the Bank of England.
There's a Rothschild on every big deal.
Right.
And they own what? I don't remember the percentage. Certainly over 75% of the central banks of the world, and almost every country has one. A few are nationalized. But no, this isn't an exaggeration. And these people have all married into their families until they've created dynasties that they don't necessarily have to have a Rothschild last name. Right. But it's the same people. The Rockefellers were made into the wealth. Carnegies were made into that wealth. Who made them? The Brits made them.
Well, we do know now from the records of the the British Ministry of Information, that the Rockefellers were funding, actually no, this was Wellington House, that the Rockefellers and the Carnegie Endowment for Peace were providing funding to the Wellington House before it became the ministry within the British War Cabinet.
The trick is, when you become rich enough, you start your own philanthropic foundations where you give your money away so you don't have to pay taxes, but those philanthropic foundations actually support your corporate interests.
Right.
And that's what's been going on all along. And it's the same old families who own the major shares of the Fortune 500 companies, but it's so tied up in asset management companies and fake rogue CIA companies and all this stuff. It's just absurd.
Yeah, we've discovered that the sets of relationships are like Russian nested dolls.
Now I'm going to tell you a little story.
Was he finished with his story about the nested dolls?
Well, there's so many dolls inside.
Maybe people don't know what nested dolls are.
Oh, please tell them.
Those are the ones where you take one doll off and there's another one inside it, and another one inside that, another one inside of that. Well, that's the way we've discovered these family dynasties have hidden who their underlying holdings are, is by putting their holdings 5, 6, 7 layers deep into these organizations. So what we see on the surface as Fidelity investment, for example, in the end, it goes back to a very few people.
And that is where I was going to go, except that you just ended on the exact perfect thing. It's very few people. So we are talking about J.K. Rowling's and her books and whether or not they're social engineering that is Tavistock-like or Franklin School-like. And certainly they are, and certainly the results have been. But let's go to where they got the inspiration to begin with. That would be J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien was part of the Inklings. In the Inklings, this group that they had in England, was C.S. Lewis. Another member, there were other members who were all anthroposophists, followers of Rudolf Steiner. Cecil Harwood, Owen Barfield, and one other person. They had a little group called the Inklings, and they met and they talked all the time, and they would share each other's writings. But one day, one of them came across, and Charles Williams, who people don't know in America, but he's one of the great novelists, spiritual novelists of England, some say equal to Bulwer Lytton. But the point is that they all got inspired from one little teensy tiny book written by David Lindsay called Journey to Arcturus. And they had all been scholars, and they were all writing these very scholarly things. And one day, I forget who it was, I don't know, perhaps C.S. Lewis brought the book in and said, I want you to read this. This book has disturbed me more than any book I've ever read in my life. And so they all read it. And afterwards, they were all so disturbed that they made a little promise that they were all going to attempt to write science fiction and to write so freely with such imaginative creativity as David Lindsay had done in his book Journey to Arcturus, that it would be their attempt. So C.S. Lewis wrote The Dark Tower. Later he wrote the Narnia series and his space trilogy. Tolkien wrote all of his works after that point. Almost every one of them was written as a response to reading David Lindsay's book. Charles Williams wrote, I think about a dozen different novels because he was inspired by that and started writing. And the other authors I could go into and what they wrote. But the point is that two of the greatest sets of books ever written and read are Tolkien's trilogy and C.S. Lewis's Narnia series or his space series. So the point is, it came down to one person, inspired them. Well, we're talking about very small groups of people who have inspired Tavistock, Wellington House. You have literally come down to showing the exact lineage and dynasty of a very small group of families. Mm-hmm. And what we need to do is make sure people know who they are, know what they're doing, so that they don't start reading Harry Potter, and because it's written so brilliantly, they forget that it's teaching children to become black magicians. Mm-hmm. And so that's the falsehood of media, and the media is the message. But we don't even take time to consider the media anymore. If it's technology, it's good. If it makes us feel good, or teaches black magic or Wicca or other crazy things, no problem. No, we need to stop and think about these things, because what's happened is what we were talking about earlier. Human thought has been set aside for this type of crazy thought, empathetic thought, a lack of empathy thought, black magic thought that becomes a bestseller. Do we forget that Harry Potter was banned by the Catholic Church? Do they ban it now?
I doubt it.
No, it's not banned now. Well, why did they ban it to begin with? If it was black magic then, and why it wasn't allowed to even go into schools, and why worldwide there were literally untold people out fighting those books being even allowed to be shown to children. And yet, what happened now? Bestseller. Because why? We're becoming dehuman. We're becoming unhuman. And that's what we're always trying to get people to do, is wake up, use your consciousness, learn how to have discernment for truth, so that you don't get pulled into whether it's the machine or whether it's the news, the fake news, or whether it's a book that you're really having a great time reading. I read the whole book, laughed. I never once thought it was black magic. I read, I think, 4 of them until I realized, wait a second, this is teaching children to want to be witches and warlocks. I mean, it didn't even cross my mind. So, what we're in is an age when we just have to lift the blinders. And I just think what you guys are doing, all those researchers, all those friends of yours over at Americans for Innovation, and what we're doing with all of our work, that it is really where we need to go, because people...
Your conclave is awesome.
Well, that's because you're an honorary member.
Oh, gee,
and they're all jealous of the fact that not one of them will speak up and be a spokesperson, but you're brave enough, to speak up not only for yourself, but for Leader Technologies and for your researchers and for Americans for Innovation and the other groups that we don't mention that you're connected with. And so, we don't mind putting our necks on the chopping block, because we're speaking the truth, and nobody can really... I'm willing to put my neck on the chopping block for the truth, but I am not for conspiracy, speculation, or the other nonsense that's out there. Fake news, or just getting hits, or any of the other things. Being a, what do they call it? One of those places that just keeps you wrapped up. A limited hangout.
Yeah, well, I think our job is to plant seeds and let God give the increase.